The distress beacon had been silent for 11 years before it suddenly turned on again. Deep in the Coalition archive, an old file marked Caldress 9 blinked from red to yellow, and a young data officer named Wren stared at his screen for a long moment before he called his supervisor. Nobody wanted to deal with that file. Caldress 9 was not just an abandoned world. It was a warning. Decades ago, a group of scientists had used the planet as a breeding ground for dangerous animals brought from many worlds, including a strange blue planet called Earth. Wolves, bears, hawks, and other creatures had been mixed with alien traits, some given glowing skin, some given poison, some given a strange kind of awareness that made them smarter than they should have been. The experiment failed. The creatures turned on their handlers, the colony was wiped out, and the planet was sealed off by ancient law. No ship was allowed to land there. No living being was allowed to leave. It was marked forbidden, and forbidden places did not send signals. Commander Talais Vaughn read the report twice before she allowed herself to believe it. She was not a woman who liked surprises. She had spent 30 years keeping her small rescue fleet alive by following rules, not chasing ghosts. But an active beacon on a dead world was not something she could ignore. She called a meeting on her ship, the Wandering Light, and laid out the situation to her senior officers. Nobody had good news. Sensors showed strange movement on the surface, large and small shapes traveling in patterns that looked almost organized. Radiation levels were stable. Weather patterns were calm. If the reports from decades ago were true, none of that should have been possible. The creatures of Caldress 9 were supposed to be chaotic, violent, and unable to live near each other, let alone in any kind of order. A younger officer named Bren Akoi spoke up during the meeting. He was new to deep space work, still eager in a way that made older officers smile, but he asked the question everyone else was avoiding. What if someone is still alive down there? The room went quiet. Commander Vaughn looked at the report again, at the small section describing the last known survivors of the colony, all listed as deceased or missing, presumed dead. Among the missing was a single name that had been nearly forgotten, a cargo transport pilot whose ship had gone down near the edge of the quarantine zone many years after the colony disaster. His name was Daniel Reyes. His ship, the homebound Star, had never been found. His body had never been recovered. At the time, the Coalition had assumed the forbidden creatures had killed him within days. Vaughn stared at that name for a long time. 11 years was too long for any being to survive alone on a planet full of dangerous animals, especially a human, a species not known for surviving in the wild without heavy technology. And yet the beacon was active. Someone or something had turned it back on. She made her decision. A small scout team would go down, just enough to investigate the signal and confirm whether it was a malfunction, a trick of old machinery finally failing, or something else entirely. She chose Bren Akoi to lead the ground team, partly because of his sharp instincts, and partly because she suspected he would push for the mission whether she approved it or not. She also assigned Dr. Yuvan Cass, the fleet's xenobiologist, a nervous but brilliant scientist who had studied the Caldress 9 disaster for years and never stopped being afraid of it. As their shuttle broke away from the Wandering Light and began its descent, the crew watched the planet grow larger on their screens. From orbit, Caldress 9 looked almost peaceful, green forests, wide rivers, and open plains that stretched for many kilometers. It did not look like a place that had swallowed an entire colony of scientists and soldiers. It looked, strangely, like it was being cared for. Bren noticed it first. Rows of land near a river that looked too straight to be natural. Paths through the forest that curved around obstacles instead of being torn through them. Small structures near the tree line that looked handmade, built from wood, stone, and pieces of old metal that shimmered faintly, clearly salvaged from a wrecked ship. Dr. Cass gripped the edge of his seat and whispered that none of this matched any prediction. The creatures on this planet were supposed to be feral, unpredictable, dangerous to anything that came near them, including each other. Order like this should not exist. As the shuttle lowered toward a clearing near one of the strange settlements, sensors picked up movement all around them, shapes moving through the trees, some large, some small, all converging toward the landing site. Bren ordered the team to stay calm and keep weapons lowered, remembering Commander Vaughn's final instruction before they left the ship. "We are here to observe, not to fight. If there is a threat, we retreat. We do not provoke." The shuttle touched down with a soft hiss, and the door opened into warm, humid air filled with unfamiliar sounds, distant calls that were part animal howl and part something else entirely, something almost like communication. The scout team stepped out slowly, weapons ready but lowered, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing attacked, nothing charged. Instead, from the shadows of the forest, large shapes began to appear, moving with quiet, deliberate steps, watching the newcomers with sharp, intelligent eyes. Bren felt his heart pounding as he realized these were not scattered wild animals. They were arriving together calmly, almost as though they had been waiting for the ship to land. And somewhere beyond the tree line, deeper in the settlement, something or someone was watching them just as closely. The first creature to step fully into the open was massive, built like a bear but taller, with thick gray fur that carried faint streaks of blue light along its spine. Its eyes were not wild. They were calm, focused, studying the scout team the way a guard studies strangers at a gate. Bren Akoy kept his hand near his weapon but did not raise it. Beside him, Dr. Cass had gone pale, his scanner shaking slightly in his hands as it fed him readings that made no sense. Heart rate stable, aggression markers low, group coordination patterns high. He whispered to Bren that this should not be possible. Every record from the old colony described these creatures as unpredictable and violent, unable to cooperate even with their own kind. More shapes emerged from the trees. A pair of lean, four-legged creatures that resembled earth wolves, but taller with faintly glowing markings along their legs, moved to flank the bear-like creature. Above them, a large winged animal, part hawk and part something else, circled once and then landed on a branch overlooking the clearing, watching everything with sharp golden eyes. None of them attacked. They simply surrounded the scout team, not in a threatening way, but in the way a group might escort visitors somewhere important. Bren lowered his weapon fully and raised his empty hands, a gesture he hoped would translate across species. The bear-like creature tilted its head, studying him for a long moment, then turned and began walking slowly toward the settlement, glancing back once as if expecting them to follow. Dr. Cass grabbed Bren's arm, his voice tight with fear. He said this had to be a trap, that no wild creature behaved like this without training, and training required a handler, and a handler on a planet full of monsters could only mean something had gone terribly wrong in a new way. Bren looked at the creatures around them, noting their calm postures, their lack of aggression, the way the wolves kept pace beside the group without ever baring their teeth. He made a decision that went against every part of his training. He told his team to follow. They walked for nearly 20 minutes through the forest, following the strange procession of animals. Along the way, they passed more signs of order that startled them further. A cleared path lined with stones. A small stream diverted through a channel that looked deliberately dug. Markings carved into certain trees, simple shapes that might have been a kind of trail guide. Dr. Cass kept muttering under his breath, cataloging every detail into his scanner, torn between terror and fascination. He said quietly that whoever or whatever had shaped this place understood these animals in a way no scientist ever had. When they finally reached the settlement, the scout team stopped walking entirely, staring in stunned silence. Before them stood a cluster of shelters built from wood, stone, and salvaged metal, the same shimmering material Bren had spotted from the shuttle earlier, clearly pieces of an old ship hull repurposed into walls and roofs. Smoke rose gently from a cooking fire near the center of the clearing. Fields stretched along the edges of the settlement, neat rows of unfamiliar plants growing in careful lines. Small animals moved freely between the shelters, birds nested in wooden frames built specifically for them, and larger creatures rested near the tree line, alert but relaxed, like guards taking a quiet shift. It looked less like the ruins of a forgotten disaster, and more like a small, thriving village. Bren scanned the area, his mind struggling to reconcile everything he had been taught about Caldress 9 with what stood in front of him. The reports had called this place a wasteland of chaos and death. Instead, it looked cared for, deliberate, alive in a way that felt organized rather than wild. The bear-like creature that had led them stopped near the center of the clearing and let out a low, rumbling sound. Almost immediately, from one of the larger shelters, a figure stepped into the open. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and a thick beard, wearing clothes stitched together from fabric, hide, and pieces of what looked like an old flight uniform. He moved with an easy confidence, unhurried, as though visitors from the sky were nothing unusual. Around him, several smaller animals gathered close, brushing against his legs the way loyal companions might. He studied the scout team for a moment, his expression more curious than afraid, and then he smiled, a tired but genuine smile. He said, in a voice rough from disuse but clear enough to understand, that it had been a very long time since anyone from the sky had bothered to come looking for him. Bren stared, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes were telling him. According to every record the fleet possessed, this man should have died more than a decade ago, torn apart within days of crashing on a planet full of forbidden creatures. Instead, he stood there calmly, surrounded by the very animals that were supposed to have killed him, looking every bit like a man who had built himself a small, strange kingdom out of nothing but patience and time. Dr. Cass finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. He asked the only question that seemed to matter in that moment. "Who are you, and how are you still alive?" The man's smile widened slightly, and he glanced around at the creatures surrounding him, as if silently thanking them for something the visitors could not yet understand. He said his name was Daniel, and then he added quietly that surviving had never really been the hard part. The hard part had been learning to belong. Daniel led the scout team toward the fire at the center of the settlement, and the creatures that had escorted them through the forest followed at a comfortable distance, settling down around the clearing, as if this were an ordinary afternoon rather than the first contact with outsiders in over a decade. Bren sat carefully on a wooden bench near the fire, still watching the bear-like creature that had guided them, unable to fully relax despite Daniel's calm behavior. Dr. Cass remained standing, scanner still raised, recording everything with the focus of a man trying to convince himself he was not dreaming. Daniel noticed the tension and chuckled softly. He said the animals would not hurt them unless they felt threatened, and as long as nobody made any sudden movements or raised a weapon, everyone would be fine. He said it the way someone might explain a house rule to a guest, calm and practical, as if wild creatures with alien traits were no different from dogs guarding a farm. Bren asked the question that had been building since they landed. He asked how any of this was possible, how a single human, alone and without proper equipment, had survived on a planet that had killed an entire trained colony. Daniel poked at the fire with a long stick before answering, his expression turning thoughtful. He explained that his transport ship, the homebound Star, had suffered a navigation failure years earlier and gone down near the edge of the quarantine zone. He had survived the crash with only minor injuries, but his communication systems were destroyed, and rescue never came. For the first few months, he said, he lived off emergency supplies from the wreck and tried to stay hidden, terrified of the creatures the old warning beacons had described as dangerous and unpredictable. He said everything changed the day he found a group of young creatures, small and starving, hiding near a dried-up section of the river. They were part wolf, part something else, their sides thin from hunger, their eyes wary but too weak to run. He said he almost left them alone, remembering every warning about the forbidden animals of Caldress 9. But something about their condition, abandoned and struggling to survive just like him, made him stay. He began leaving them small amounts of food from his rations, keeping his distance at first, letting them approach on their own terms. Slowly, over weeks, they stopped fleeing when he came near. He said it wasn't training in the way people usually meant the word. It was patience, consistency, showing up every day, never forcing anything, never expecting trust to happen faster than it naturally could. Dr. Cass interrupted, his voice sharp with disbelief. He said the historical reports described these creatures as impossible to domesticate, prone to sudden aggression, dangerous even to each other. He asked how Daniel had avoided being killed in those early days. Daniel's expression grew more serious. He admitted there had been dangerous moments, animals that lashed out from fear or old trauma, injuries he had to treat with nothing but what he could find in the wild. He said survival had never been guaranteed, and more than once he thought he would not last the week. But he also said something the old reports never considered. The creatures on this planet weren't naturally violent. They were the product of failed experiments, taken from their homes, altered against their will, and treated with fear and control by the very people who created them. When the colony's scientists died, the creatures were left alone, traumatized, and hunted only by their own confusion and pain. He said he simply chose not to be another threat. Over the following seasons, more creatures began to trust him, not just the young pack that first approached him, but others scattered across the region, driven by hunger and isolation. He learned their behaviors, their warning signs, the subtle differences between fear and aggression. He built shelters not just for himself but for them, using materials from his wrecked ship combined with what the land provided. He learned to read the winged hawk-like creatures well enough to send them scouting ahead of him. He learned which of the wolf-like creatures were natural leaders, and let them guide the younger ones instead of trying to control everything himself. Bren asked quietly why Daniel never tried to signal for help once his systems allowed for it. Daniel was quiet for a moment before answering. He said he did try in the early years, sending out weak signals whenever he managed to repair pieces of old equipment. But no response ever came, and eventually, survival became less about waiting to be rescued and more about building a life he could actually live. He said somewhere along the way, this place stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like something closer to home. Dr. Cass lowered his scanner slowly, staring at the creatures resting peacefully around the clearing, creatures his own research had once labeled a permanent, unsolvable threat. He said, almost to himself, that nothing about this matched any model the Coalition had ever built. Daniel smiled faintly and looked around at the animals surrounding him, the great bear-like guardian near the fire, the wolf-like pack resting by the shelters, the hawk-like flyer perched above them all. He said quietly that maybe the problem was never the creatures. Maybe the problem was that nobody had ever bothered to stay long enough to understand them. Bren looked around the settlement with new eyes, no longer seeing a wasteland of forbidden monsters, but something closer to a fragile, hard-won piece, built slowly over 11 long years by one man who refused to give up on creatures everyone else had already condemned. The days that followed changed everything the scout team believed about Caldress 9. Commander Vaughn, after receiving Bren's first report from the surface, made the decision to come down herself, bringing a second shuttle with additional supplies and a stronger communication relay. She arrived expecting to find a fragile, desperate survivor barely holding on. Instead, she found Daniel repairing a section of fence near one of the fields, a large winged creature perched calmly on a post beside him, watching the newcomers with sharp, curious eyes. Vaughn had commanded rescue missions for 30 years, and very few things still surprised her. This did. Daniel greeted her the same way he had greeted Bren, calm and unhurried, offering her a seat near the fire and a cup of something warm brewed from local plants. She accepted cautiously, watching the creatures around the settlement with the wary eyes of someone trained to see danger first and understanding second. Dr. Cass, now far more comfortable than he had been on the first day, spent his time moving between the animals with a scanner in hand, recording behavior patterns that contradicted years of his own research. He explained to Vaughn that the creatures showed clear signs of structured social behavior, cooperation between species that should have been biologically incompatible, and something even stranger, a level of trust directed toward Daniel that resembled loyalty more than domestication. Vaughn watched as Daniel walked to the edge of the settlement and let out a low whistle. Within moments, one of the wolf-like creatures approached, not with fear or submission, but with the relaxed confidence of an equal greeting a friend. Daniel knelt down, running a hand along its side, and the creature leaned into the touch before trotting off toward the tree line, disappearing to patrol the perimeter without needing to be told twice. Vaughn asked how he managed something like that, without any formal training in animal behavior. Daniel shrugged and said he never thought of it as training at all. He said most of what he learned came from mistakes, moments where he pushed too hard, moved too fast, or misunderstood a warning sign and paid for it with a scar or two. Over time, he learned to listen more than he acted, to let the creatures set the pace of trust instead of forcing it. He said the wolves reminded him of dogs he had grown up around back on Earth, and the massive bear-like guardians reminded him of livestock he had helped raise on his family's land as a boy. He said it was strange, but sometimes the alien traits mattered far less than the simple, familiar instincts underneath them. Vaughn's expression shifted slightly at that, something between disbelief and quiet respect. She admitted that nothing about this matched the disaster reports the coalition had relied on for decades. Those reports described mindless aggression, uncontrollable violence, a total breakdown of order. What she was seeing instead was closer to a functioning ecosystem, built patiently by a single person with nothing but time and persistence. Later that day, Daniel showed her more of what he had built. A section of cultivated fields where root vegetables grew in neat rows, tended partly by hand and partly by a large, slow-moving creature that pushed a crude wooden plow along the furrows without needing direction. A fresh water system fed by a stream, guided through hollowed logs into a storage pool near the shelters. A small enclosure where injured animals recovered under his care, tended with medical knowledge he had slowly relearned, and adapted using local plants after his original medical supplies ran out. Bren, walking beside them, admitted quietly that this was nothing like the world he had been trained to expect. He said the Coalition's laws treated Caldress 9 as a permanent threat, a mistake too dangerous to ever be corrected. Yet here it was, corrected, not through weapons or containment, but through patience. Dr. Cass, reviewing his data late into the evening, finally voiced the thought that had clearly been building in him for hours. He said what Daniel had built here wasn't just survival. It was proof, real and undeniable, that the forbidden creatures were never truly beyond saving. They had simply never been given a chance. Commander Vaughn sat quietly by the fire that night, watching Daniel move easily among creatures the rest of the galaxy still feared, and she understood the weight of the decision now resting on her shoulders. Coalition law was clear. Caldress 9 was forbidden, its creatures marked for eventual extermination the moment resources allowed for it. Reporting what she had found here could change that. It could also bring consequences neither she nor Daniel could fully predict. She asked him directly if he understood what it would mean to reveal all of this to the wider coalition. The scrutiny, the danger, the possibility that officials might see his settlement not as a discovery worth protecting, but as an uncontrolled risk that needed to be erased. Daniel looked out at the fields, the shelters, the animals resting peacefully under the darkening sky, all of it built slowly across 11 difficult years. He said quietly that he understood the risk better than anyone, but he also said he was done hiding, done pretending this place, and these creatures didn't matter simply because it was easier for people far away to believe the old fears instead of the truth in front of them. He looked at Vaughn steadily and said if the coalition wanted to take him home, they would have to accept that this settlement, and everyone living in it, was part of the deal. Vaughn didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, slowly, already knowing the difficult conversation waiting for her once she returned to her ship. The message commander Vaughn sent to Coalition Command that night caused more chaos than she expected. Within hours of her report reaching the Central Authority, Caldress 9 became the center of heated debate across multiple star systems. Some officials were fascinated, eager to study what Daniel had accomplished. Others were furious, insisting the old quarantine law existed for good reason, and that any deviation from it, especially one involving the forbidden creatures roaming freely, was a threat too dangerous to tolerate. Vaughn spent 2 days fielding demands from distant council members, some requesting more data, others demanding she remove Daniel immediately and prepare the planet for sterilization procedures that had been sitting dormant in old Coalition archives for decades. She resisted the second option as long as she could, buying time by insisting further study was necessary before any drastic action was taken. Down on the surface, Daniel remained calm despite the growing tension, continuing his daily routines as though the fate of his home wasn't currently being debated by people who had never set foot on the planet. Bren noticed the strain beneath his calm exterior, though the way his eyes lingered a little longer on the fields, on the creatures resting near the shelters, as if memorizing every detail in case it was all about to be taken from him. Dr. Cass worked tirelessly, compiling every piece of evidence he could gather, behavioral data, ecosystem stability reports, proof of cooperative structures among the creatures that directly contradicted decades of assumed danger. He argued passionately in every transmission he sent that what existed on Caldress 9 was not a containment breach, but a scientific breakthrough, one that could change how the Coalition understood traumatized and genetically altered species across many worlds. Despite his efforts, the fear-driven faction within the Coalition grew louder. On the third day, a heavily armed Coalition vessel entered the system without prior warning, carrying direct orders from a council official named Director Hesk, a man known for strict adherence to old containment laws and very little patience for exceptions. Vaughn intercepted the transmission personally, her voice tense as she demanded an explanation. Hesk informed her, without much sympathy, that the sterilization order for Caldress 9 had never technically been rescinded, only delayed due to limited resources decades earlier. Now that resources were available and a potential security risk had been confirmed on the surface, the original order would finally be carried out. Vaughn argued fiercely, citing Dr. Cass's research, citing the clear evidence of stability and cooperation among the creatures, citing the simple fact that a human being had survived and thrived there for over a decade without a single fatal incident once trust had been established. Hesk remained unmoved, insisting that one man's survival did not erase the historical danger the planet represented, and that allowing sentiment to override established law would set a dangerous precedent. When Bren relayed the situation to Daniel, expecting fear or panic, he instead found something closer to quiet resolve. Daniel gathered the settlement's key creatures around him, the great bear-like guardian, the wolf-like pack leaders, the hawk-like scout that had served as his eyes across the region for years, almost as if seeking their presence for strength rather than protection. He told Bren plainly that he would not leave without them, and he would not stand by while a decision made by people who had never once set foot on this world decided to erase everything built here out of fear. Vaughn, faced with an impossible situation, made a bold decision of her own. She requested a direct, in-person meeting between Director Hesk and Daniel before any sterilization order could be carried out, invoking an old coalition regulation that allowed affected parties, a final hearing before irreversible action was taken against inhabited territory. It was a technicality, one that Hesk clearly did not appreciate, but coalition law was strict about its own procedures, and even he could not ignore it outright without risking his own position. Reluctantly, Hesk agreed to a limited visit, giving Vaughn only a single day to prove her case before the operation would proceed regardless of the outcome. That night, tension hung heavily over the settlement. Dr. Cass worked without rest, preparing every piece of evidence into a presentation clear enough for even the most skeptical official to understand. Bren spent hours with Daniel, discussing what exactly they could show Hesk that words alone had failed to convince him of. Daniel, watching the animals settle down for the night around the glowing embers of the fire, said quietly that reports and data were important, but they weren't what had convinced him all those years ago that these creatures deserved a chance. What convinced him was simply spending time among them, seeing their behavior firsthand instead of through the fear-filled records of people who had never tried to understand them. He said if words and data weren't enough to convince Hesk, then maybe it was time to let the creatures speak for themselves. Vaughn, listening quietly nearby, felt a small flicker of hope for the first time since the sterilization order arrived. She didn't yet know exactly what Daniel intended, but she trusted, after everything she had witnessed over the past few days, that he understood this world and its inhabitants better than anyone in the coalition ever could. As the first light of morning approached, marking the final day before Director Hesk's ultimatum came due, the settlement stirred to life with an unusual sense of quiet determination, every creature and every person within it aware, in their own way, that everything they had built together now depended on the events of the next few hours. Director Hesk's shuttle landed at the edge of the settlement just after midday, its sleek armored hull looking sharply out of place among the wooden shelters and quiet fields. He stepped out flanked by two armed escorts, his expression already set with the firm skepticism of a man who had made up his mind long before arriving. Commander Vaughn met him at the landing site, her posture formal despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her after days of arguing his decision. She led him toward the center of the settlement, where Daniel stood waiting, calm as ever, surrounded by the same creatures who had first startled the scout team days earlier. Hesk barely hid his discomfort at the sight of the great bear-like guardian resting near the fire, or the wolf-like pack watching him with sharp, attentive eyes from a respectful distance. He said bluntly that none of this changed the fundamental danger these creatures represented, regardless of how tame they appeared in front of an audience. Daniel didn't argue right away. Instead, he simply asked Hesk to walk with him. Reluctantly, with his escorts close behind, Hesk followed Daniel through the settlement, past the fields tended by patient, careful movements of animals working almost like trained hands. He saw the injured creature enclosure, where a young wolf-like animal with a healing leg rested peacefully, unafraid of the strangers passing by. He saw the water system, the storage shelters, the careful signs of a functioning, self-sustaining community built without any of the violent chaos the old reports had promised. Still, Hesk remained guarded, insisting that isolated calm did not erase the risk of unpredictable aggression, especially from creatures whose genetic instability had never been fully studied before now. It was then that Daniel did something Bren hadn't expected. He walked toward the tree line and let out a long, low call, different from anything he had used before. Moments later, nearly a dozen creatures emerged from the forest at once, wolves, hawks, and several smaller animals that hadn't shown themselves to the scout team until now, gathering calmly around the clearing without a single sign of aggression, despite the presence of armed strangers. He explained that every creature here had at some point been capable of real violence, driven by fear, pain, or trauma left behind by the failed experiments that created them. What changed wasn't their nature. It was the environment around them. Consistency, patience, safety offered without conditions. He said fear had built the disaster the coalition remembered. Trust had built everything standing here now. Dr. Cass stepped forward at that point, presenting the data he had spent days compiling: behavioral stability charts, cooperative interaction logs, medical records showing 0 fatal incidents involving the creatures once trust had been firmly established years earlier. He argued that Caldress 9 was no longer the uncontrollable threat described in old reports, but a living example of what patient understanding could accomplish, even with species everyone else had given up on. Hesk studied the data in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked around at the creatures resting peacefully nearby, at the fields, at the careful order built from nothing but 11 years of quiet, difficult work. Finally, he asked Daniel directly why he hadn't simply left the moment rescue became possible, choosing instead to stay and fight for creatures the rest of the galaxy still feared. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. He said that somewhere during those long years, these animals stopped being the forbidden creatures from old warning files and became something else entirely, a family built out of shared survival. He said leaving them behind now, after everything, wasn't something he was willing to do, no matter what any old law demanded. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Bren feared the worst. Then, slowly, Hesk exhaled and admitted, with clear reluctance, that the evidence in front of him didn't match anything the sterilization order had been built upon. He said he would suspend the operation pending a full council review, though he warned that a final decision could still take time, and success wasn't guaranteed. It was enough for now. Over the following months, with Dr. Cass's research and Commander Vaughn's persistent advocacy, the Coalition Council slowly reconsidered its position. Additional scientists visited Caldress 9, each confirming what the original scout team had already witnessed firsthand. Eventually, under mounting evidence and public interest sparked by news of the settlement's existence, the ancient quarantine order was formally lifted and replaced with a new designation, a protected reserve, one of the first of its kind, dedicated to understanding and rehabilitating genetically altered creatures instead of simply fearing them. Daniel was named the reserve's official caretaker, a role he accepted without hesitation, choosing to remain on the world he had quietly built into a home over more than a decade of struggle. On the day the new coalition banner was raised near the settlement, replacing the old warning markers that had stood there for decades, Daniel stood at the center of his fields, surrounded by the same creatures who had once been condemned as forbidden monsters. Above him, coalition ships hovered quietly in the sky, no longer arriving with fear or weapons, but with respect for what had been accomplished here. Bren, standing beside him, asked quietly what Daniel planned to do now that the fight was finally over. Daniel looked around at the fields, the shelters, the animals resting peacefully in the afternoon sun, and smiled the same tired, genuine smile he had worn the day the rescue fleet first found him. He said simply that he planned to keep doing exactly what he had always done, taking care of the ones nobody else believed in, one patient day at a time.